Thanks a lot. So, 26 slides, 15 minutes. Do the math. It's going to be tricky. So, what I'm going to do is first ignore what my marketing guy says and skip all these slides, which tells you where I come from. It's a law firm, surprise, surprise. Based in Singapore, but we have offices all over Asia Pacific, 9 different jurisdictions. We have about 60 lawyers here in Thailand, about 400 in Singapore. What I want to share with you today, though, is the developments that are going on in this particular space at a policy level, at a regulatory level. And we are quite busy, we meaning lawyers in this space, are very busy addressing these issues, first by engaging with the stakeholders involved in the service provision, and second in terms of the regulators themselves. Firstly, from a capacity building standpoint, so people have a basic understanding of the principles I'm going to touch on, net neutrality, machine-to-machine technologies, and secondly, in terms of coming up with rational positions. And by positions, I don't mean licenses, because there is always this tendency for regulators to presume that the only way in which you can manage new technologies, new services, is to find a way to regulate, and therefore regulate equals license a service. That may make sense from a revenue generation standpoint, so you see a lot of regulators saying, well, this is a money-making proposition for us, but that's not necessarily so. So I'm very troubled when I read, for example, that Indonesia is going to be issuing regulations on OTT, potentially as soon as today, mid-March. When in fact, one questions whether the OTT space requires any form of specific regulations at all. So these are the sort of issues that I'll be touching on. And let me start first with a very interesting discussion that we have in Singapore and around the region on net neutrality. First, as I said, a very brief definition. This is by no means definitive. I don't have the luxury of time to do that. But for the purpose of today's presentation, when I'm referring to net neutrality, I'm basically referring to the principle that all ISPs, network providers, carriers, etc., are treating all sources of data and internet content equally and on a non-discriminatory basis. So whether I'm using the internet to browse the web, or I'm using the internet to watch a show on Netflix, or for the purpose of Skype, WhatsApp, etc., there's a single rate that's to be paid because data is to be treated in an agnostic manner. That's the idealistic position that many take. I guess when I use the word idealistic, that's a rather loaded term and it might give you an idea of where I'm coming from. But it is what it is, so bear with me. The challenges that people have today is when you look at it from a carrier standpoint in particular, is that carriers really look at data transmission from the perspective of having the most optimized structure in place for the transfer of data from point A to point B, not necessarily the most regulatorily beneficial structure for transmission of data from point A to point B, because that will not be either cost effective nor would it be efficient from a network standpoint. However, with these layers coming in terms of net neutrality, etc., there is apparently a need for us to actually look at that, look at packet sniffing, look at prioritizing data provision based on the services that individuals consume. These are questions that need to be addressed not at a very banal level, but at a very specific level, looking at the manner and the reasoning behind why carriers do what they do, and whether by regulating this space, regulators could potentially kill the innovation that carriers and ISPs and others are trying to bring to the space. But on the other hand, and again, I'm here to speak on both sides, I'm not going to take sides, not today. It is clear that net neutrality has its benefits also, and so you see many champions with very vociferous and very convincing arguments as to why net neutrality is in fact the way to go and that there should not be any form of discrimination between data because all data should be treated in an agnostic manner. But where do these parties sort of fall? Again, in broad terms. Bearing in mind I've got 10 minutes and 54 seconds. The proponents and the opponents. Proponents basically say, well, you need to have net neutrality. There's an angle in terms of protection of consumers, and smaller players need to be given opportunity, and it encourages innovation. The opponents also apparently say that it stifles innovation, and so we should have a form of this discrimination in terms of pricing. It stifles the right to optimize the use of network resources, discourages investment in infrastructure, obstructs the ability to maintain quality of service standards through traffic shaping or prioritization, all of which would be very sensible issues if you speak to any network engineer out there. So which side do you take? You could take a very agnostic or some say idealistic standpoint and stand in the blue corner, or take a very network-centric, network optimization standpoint and stand in the green corner. There is no right or wrong. That's why there's no red In my view, both arguments do carry weight, and we need to therefore, from a regulator standpoint, I have a lot of sympathy for them trying to come up with regulations in this area. One regulator, very brave regulator, TRAI, chose to throw their hat into the mix, and they issued the Prohibition of Discriminatory Tariffs for Data Services Regulation 2016, which is very long, but I'm just going to select one particular sentence. No service provider can offer or charge discriminatory tariffs for data services on the basis of contact. Is this the way forward? Well, we've all seen what's happened in the recent debacle that Facebook had in India as a result. But clearly, we need a lot of disruption in this industry, and so they're seen clearly as an asset. Both ISPs and telcos provide similar services in this space, so there's a lot of overlap going on. Telcos have significant pressure. We've heard about what's going on in the voice space. So looking at increasing ARPU through diversification into the media space, it seems to be a trend that I'm observing. And so again, you see a lot of telcos going to the OTT space. And that often leads to inconsistency in treatment, because if an incumbent is also an OTT, should they not be subject to the same rules and regulations as a pure play OTT player? The answer is no, because they would already have been regulated under a pre-existing license. And so the argument would be, I don't need any further regulation. And then when an OTT player comes in, the position would be, as an incumbent, OTT player also has to be subject to the same rules and regulations that I am, without accepting the fact that as an OTT player, I'm not infra heavy, I'm not infrastructure heavy, and most of the regulations, most of the licenses that exist in Asia Pacific today do not accommodate an OTT business model. They just don't. And so for many of the battles that we have fought around the region in terms of getting exemptions from players from licensing, it's been a hard task, because the instinct for many regulators is to apply the existing licensing frameworks on OTT players who simply are not telco players, they're not media players, they are streaming over the top content providers, very different from any of the licenses that you see today. So I'm very interested in seeing whether the regulators would go one step further and issue sui generis, as in unique new types of licenses that truly address the business models that OTT players put forward. That's one possibility, and if that's not what they're doing, then please don't force existing licenses onto the players, because it just doesn't work. So is regulation for OTT players the answer? I suppose some forms of OB markers in terms of content will be inevitable, but beyond that, it's hoped that we don't see any regulations over the types of arrangements, the type of partnerships the OTT players can have. So that's what we really have in terms of moving forward. We have traditional regulatory and licensing frameworks in blue. You have a need to address the current inconsistencies in the treatment of telcos and OTT providers and other potential risks. And then you have a move towards deregulation to level the playing field, potentially, or new forms of licenses based on function/type approval. We'll have to wait and see what exactly is going to occur, but that's the red space right now. That's where there's no certainty. The next issue that I want to just touch on, actually I had a chance to cover it earlier, was the issue of zero rating and net neutrality, the overlap that happens there. So since I touched on it, I won't go into it, but you'll have access to the slides. So with some of these issues going on, and bearing in mind I have 48 seconds to go, where are we as far as Asia Pacific is concerned? It's a truly unique situation. We have a jurisdiction where there's a lot of new infrastructure coming into play. So we have assets, infrastructure assets that are coming in, which are optimized for OTT play, optimized for streaming technology. While there are many other players or countries in the West where there's a need to protect some incumbent infrastructure, some pre-existing infrastructure. My view, therefore, is that the arguments that go on in Europe and US do not necessarily translate directly for application into Asia Pacific. They just do not. Because the level of protection required by incumbents here, ironically, is a lot less than it would be in the traditional jurisdictions. There's a need for a greater degree of play, space rather, allow for the new players to come in and to launch the new services. And that includes players in the social media space as well, your Facebooks, your Googles. Because as we all know, and as I've also been directly involved, there are significant amounts of infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure assets being put in place by social media players. If you look at the IRU arrangements, the amount of capacity that's being purchased by many social media players, Microsoft, Amazon included, you cannot consider these as mere consumers of data, but they are in fact the entities who are conducting telecommunication services, albeit for their own purposes. That's where it gets a bit dicey these days, because when you say for your own purposes, if you were Facebook and you have Facebook Messenger or your own WhatsApp, is the bandwidth truly for your own purposes, or is it in fact used by your users? And then are you therefore, by extension, a telco service provider, whether or not you want to be known as one? And so then again, should you be regulated as a telco? These are sort of questions that you find being asked here as well as in the rest of the world. And the regulators need to step up and look at either taking positions or seeking further feedback from industry before taking concrete licensing positions that may not suit the needs of the industry as it stands. So what about APAC? What stand can we potentially take? Well, I think we need to, as I mentioned before, look at the issue of infrastructure, look at the issue of cultural diversity that exists here, the differences in the network and telecommunications infrastructure in each country is significantly diverse. It's very different. You've got very high density jurisdictions like Singapore and very low density jurisdictions just around the corner in Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, for example. And varying levels of internet access and internet adoption rates as well across the region. So the challenge often would be, how do you come up with a single approach? The final point I want to touch on was 5G, IoT. I don't have time to go into that, but if I may very, very quickly just touch on it. One point, machine-to-machine licensing. It is here, it is real. When we act for various clients like logistics providers, and you put these little devices onto the vehicles to track them, they're using for tracking purposes. And yet we need 7 government agencies to provide clearances before these things can go live. 7 because Ministry of Defense will say, well, you could commandeer a truck and drive it into a secure facility, right? Therefore, there's a defense angle to it. And so we often work hand in hand with regulators and try and come to a degree of rationality to approach the issue of IoT from the standpoint of, look, this is not something that's a passing fad. This is the way forward. There is already significantly more communications machine to machine than there is human to machine or human to human. And that's only going to increase over time, as the speakers have shared this morning. So there's a need for us to look at, again, rethinking the M2M licensing frameworks that have been put in place, or to put a framework in place if they haven't yet been done. Because apart from what I've spoken about, there are also cybersecurity threats, and there's also data protection concerns in terms of some of these devices, especially those that have tracking ability and location-based functionality. So those are some of the key issues that need to be looked at. Data protection is also another core area of concern. And then there are challenges with regard to spectrum and bandwidth management, which I've touched on earlier, and of particular concern to carriers as well. In terms of ensuring sufficient bandwidth and spectrum capacity to meet increasing demands for M2M communications. There's a skew now still towards traditional telecommunications without realizing the fact that M2M is really taking over, has taken over, and will increasingly be the dominant consumer of telecommunication resources that we're facing today. There is no recognition of that fact either from my experience in the Asia-Pacific region. So a fair bit of thinking to do. At the end of the day, watch this space. Lots of changes going on. Those in the stakeholders I speak to here you guys are on the front line. You will see these problems day to day from a regulatory standpoint. Good luck to you, and good luck to the regulators. We've all got a lot of work to do. Thank you.